There's a speaker on the corner, nothing special, a black box sitting on a plastic table, cables snaking toward a generator, a needle dropping onto a vinyl record. But when the beat kicks in, something shifts in the air. People who are scattered across the street start moving differently. It's not just dancing, it's recognition. It's as if the rhythm was saying out loud what everyone had been carrying inside and hadn't yet found a way to release. That's the heart of everything. Not a recording studio, not a concert hall, not a record deal. That corner, that speaker, that beat looping over and over and suddenly opening a door for a voice. Hip-hop wasn't designed, it was necessary. And that difference explains almost everything. In the early 1970s, the Bronx was one of the most neglected neighborhoods in New York City. Decades of poorly planned urban policy, systematic disinvestment, structural poverty, and forced displacement had turned that area into a map of tensions. Fires gutted entire buildings. Public services collapsed. Gangs controlled city blocks, and violence was part of the daily landscape. But there was also community. There were people who danced, who gathered, who found ways to be together without it costing what they didn't have. In that context, block parties were something more than entertainment. They were territory. They were the moment when the neighborhood stopped being just a backdrop for hardship and became a space of its own life. And at those parties, the DJ was the central figure. Not a musician playing an instrument, but someone who handled records, who mixed, who extended the fragments that got people moving the most, who found in the cuts between songs a new way of building sound. Clive Campbell, known as DJ Kool Herc, was one of the first to do something that seemed simple but would change the history of popular music. He isolated the instrumental section of a song, the moment where the drums and bass break loose on their own, and repeated it over and over using 2 copies of the same record in alternation. That loop, that deliberate repetition of the break, gave dancers more time to express themselves. And in the process, without meaning to, he invented a new grammar. The rhythmic foundation that came out of that technique wasn't decoration. It was the pulse on which something else could live. Because when someone steps up to that beat and starts speaking in rhythm, something transforms. The word no longer needs melody to hold itself up. It holds itself up on the beat, on the repetition, on the steady pulse that gives it structure and energy. That is rap. And rap didn't come from anywhere else. It came from there, from that need to speak over a rhythm that was already in motion. What rap did with language was something few musical forms had ever managed so directly. Rhyme in hip-hop is not an ornament, not a decorative literary device. It is a tool of presence. Rhyming well in this context means your voice takes up space, that each line lands with force, that what you say carries the weight of what you've lived. The earliest hip-hop rhymes weren't about imaginary worlds or abstract emotions. They were about the neighborhood, the police, the money that never stretched far enough, the energy of the party, the pride of being who you were even when the world didn't look at you with respect. That connection between everyday experience and artistic language is what gave hip-hop a credibility other genres couldn't manufacture. There was no distance between the person performing and what they were performing about. The story was personal, collective, geographic. The neighborhood appeared in the lyrics as something alive, something that belonged to them. The block wasn't the backdrop of the story, it was the story itself. But hip-hop was never just rap. From its earliest years, it took shape as a broader culture moving in 4 directions at once. The DJ mixing records, the MC taking the mic and rapping over them, the b-boy and b-girl carrying the rhythm into their bodies through what would become known as breakdancing, and the writer taking identity onto the urban landscape through graffiti. Each of these expressions was a different way of saying the same thing. I'm here, I exist, this is mine too. What connects all 4 of these forms is not just a musical genre, but an attitude toward available materials. Hip-hop was born from the logic of reusing, recontextualizing, transforming what was on hand into something new. The DJ didn't buy expensive instruments, he used old records, borrowed equipment, improvised cables. The writer didn't have a studio or a gallery, he had the subway wall and a spray can. The b-boy didn't have a dance school, he had a piece of cardboard on the street and the rhythm coming out of the speaker. That creativity born from scarcity is not some heroic limitation to be overcome. It's part of the genre's deepest identity. Restriction became method, and method became aesthetic. There's something in the musical structure of hip-hop that also deserves attention. Unlike other genres that build emotion primarily through melody, hip-hop builds it mainly through rhythm and texture. The sample, a fragment of an existing recording incorporated into a new production, became one of the central tools of the genre. The point wasn't to copy, but to transform, to take a unit of sound and give it a new context, new weight, new life. A funk fragment from the 1960s could become, decades later, the foundation on which someone told their own story. That relationship with earlier music is not careless borrowing, it's a conversation. It's proof that hip-hop was always in dialogue with other traditions, absorbing blues, soul, jazz, funk, Caribbean music, African rhythms, and building something that carried all of those influences but sounded like nothing that had existed before. Through the 1980s, hip-hop expanded well beyond the Bronx. It reached other neighborhoods in New York, then other cities across the country, and with that came diversification. The East Coast and the West Coast developed their own sounds, their own attitudes, their own vocabularies. The hip-hop coming out of Los Angeles carried the weight of the asphalt and the sun, of a wider, more fragmented city. Atlanta later brought a different pulse, a different way of moving over the beat. And so it kept branching out, adapting, without ever losing its core. The voice speaking over rhythm, the words saying something that matters. By the 1990s, hip-hop had become the dominant cultural force in American popular music. But the more important thing was happening at the same time. It was crossing borders in a way that no record deal could have planned. In France, a massive scene emerged, fueled in part by African and Caribbean communities on the outskirts of Paris. In Brazil, rap absorbed the rhythms of the interior and the tension of the favelas and built something entirely its own. In Senegal, in the United Kingdom, in Japan, in Cuba, in Colombia, in Nigeria, hip-hop arrived and took hold not as imitation, but as a tool. A tool to do exactly what it had done in the Bronx, turn identity into words, experience into rhythm, territory into voice. That global reach can't be explained by the entertainment industry alone. It's explained by the fact that hip-hop solved something that communities around the world needed to solve. How to say what you live when no one hands you the microphone. How to build identity when the media doesn't reflect you. How to turn what you have into something that matters, something that lasts, something others recognize as yours. There were moments when hip-hop was dismissed as a passing trend, a youth phenomenon that would eventually run out of steam. That never happened. Today, it is the most listened to genre in the world, but beyond that statistic, what endures is something deeper. A way of telling stories, a way of producing sound, a way of standing in front of the world with your identity held high and saying, this is who I am, this is where I come from, this is what I think. That is not a trend. That is a legacy. The impact of hip-hop never stayed inside music either. It transformed fashion, everyday language, advertising, film, politics, and visual art. Visual artists, designers, writers, and filmmakers absorbed the aesthetic and the attitude of hip-hop and carried it into their own territories. Hip-hop vocabulary entered the dictionary. Its style of dress redefined entire industries. Its references appear everywhere, from the biggest stages to the classroom. What hip-hop proved, practically and without asking anyone's permission, is that culture doesn't need resources to have power. It needs authenticity, community, and the sense that what is being said has roots in something real. The Bronx of the 1970s had almost nothing that the cultural industry considered necessary to produce something lasting. And yet it produced one of the most profound artistic revolutions of the 20th century. It wasn't magic. It was the sum of many people who found in rhythm and in language a way to name themselves, who took what was available and turned it into something no one had heard before, who made the street not just a place where things happen, but a place where things are created. Hip-hop is still that. It doesn't matter what city it comes from today, what language it arrives in, what context carries it. What defines it is not an exact sound or a specific formula. What defines it is that decision to take the word, to build identity from the inside out, to turn the most difficult surroundings into raw material for creation. That is its essential grammar. And that grammar has no expiration date.